The Empire State, one of the most lived-in states in the entire American Union, birthed back in the days of the 13 colonies. New York State has a history worth exploring. The earliest known inhabitants of what we know today as the state of New York were indigenous tribes of ancient times. Estimated to have made their home in the area all the way back around 10,000 BC, Native Americans spent centuries within New York's boundaries, and additional tribes, such as the Iroquois, would migrate from surrounding regions to join them. By the time of European exploration on America's East Coast, a handful of indigenous tribes called New York their home, and could be divided into two categories: the Iroquoian-speaking tribes and the Algonquin-speaking tribes. The former grouping included tribes such as the Seneca, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, and Cayuga, while the latter described others like the Lenni Lenape, Mohegan, and Wappinger tribes. The indigenous populations of this region had developed quite sophisticated systems of economy, farming, and culture, as well as a significant alliance deemed the Iroquoian Confederacy. None of this, however, mattered much to the Europeans when they foreseeably made their way to the eastern coast of the New World. There were two explorers who first stumbled across the New York lands, but can't be credited with doing much upon their arrival. In 1524, a French-employed Italian explorer by the name of Giovanni da Verrazzano was sailing along the Atlantic when he found himself in what we know today as the New York Harbor, and eventually modern-day Manhattan. He wrote of his exploration, but did little more in the way of colonizing New York than that. And the same could be said for Jacques Cartier, a French explorer who made similar explorations in 1535. It wasn't until another man, one Henry Hudson, under the employment of the Dutch East India Company, made his way to New York in 1609 that colonization became an intention. Quite a few years after the others, but unlike the others, his goal was, on behalf of the Dutch, to create the beginnings of a colony. Thus, in 1614, the Dutch built the first ever European settlement within the borders of today's New York. Fort Nassau, constructed under the watchful eye of Hendrik Christiansen, was located near modern-day Albany and had the main purpose of being a trading post, particularly for the booming fur trade. By the mid-1620s, a few dozen Dutch families had migrated to the new colony as merchants and were encouraged to make the move. The budding colony was given the moniker of New Netherlands, and by 1624, what we know today as New York was founded as New Amsterdam. A new, more permanent settlement, Fort Orange, would further replace Fort Nassau as the Dutch headquarters in New York, and immigrants from across Europe were already flocking to the new colony and promise of a new, better life. The problem for the Dutch, however, was that the English wanted what the Dutch had. In the midst of the Second Anglo-Dutch War, the entire colony of New Netherlands fell into England's hands and was renamed New York. The city of New Amsterdam was also unimaginatively given the refreshed name of New York, though this was retaken by the Dutch in 1673 during the Third Anglo-Dutch War. Instead of restoring the city's old name, the Dutch called it New Orange for a year, until they lost it to the English again. One city aside, though, the colony now named New York was still growing under its new ownership. When the English had taken over, the settlement hosted an estimated maximum of 8,000 residents. Roughly a century later, it would be home to around 168,000. As was the case at the start, Many Europeans fled their homelands for the New World as a result of famine, religious persecution, economic woes, or other troubles in their homeland. Some were simply looking for new opportunities and a better chance at a good life. New York's economy was quite a success, agriculture being a particularly important factor. The colonists were doing quite well, and many grew to tolerate their indigenous neighbors, but others didn't. The French, who had their own colonial ambitions in the surrounding area, had sponsored multiple Catholic missions that extended into the borders of today's New York. Religious and merchant endeavors led them into direct conflict with the British, but it also led them to form some important friendships with native tribes. Tensions eventually boiled over into the French and Indian War, which saw the indigenous fight alongside both the Brits and the French, and an eventual British victory leading to the loss of France's territory on New York soil in 1763.